Hi, and welcome back to C. Myers Live. My name is Brian McHenry, and I'm a principal with C. Myers Corporation.
And I'm Charlene Leland. I'm a vice president with C. Myers. And today we want to talk a little bit about critical thinking. And, we've done a few podcasts on this before, and we've had a number of classes in our offices. And we thought this would be a great time to go back and revisit what are some of the biggest takeaways that we're seeing in the critical thinking area. How does communication fit in to the critical thinking question?
Yeah, it's a great question, and actually, that's one of the main things that we've seen in doing a lot of the critical thinking engagements and workshops is people needing to ask more questions. It's one of the big takeaways quite often in working with the different groups is that there's some assumptions that'll come up that around understanding. They understand what the conversation's about. They understand what the objective is, and people just aren't stepping back and saying, "Well, let me just check my understanding here. Let me ask a couple of questions." And it's coming from both sides, I'll say, on from a leader's perspective, they're telling something, they're sharing something in a conversation with their peers or some direct reports, and they're not stepping back and checking in with those folks to say, well, do they understand what I'm saying? So asking some questions there. And then on the other side, those folks that are listening and sort of receiving the information, they're not also saying, let me check that understanding again. And so what ends up happening is people think, oh, well, I've shared, it's clear. They understand what they need to do, or they understand what the objective is and where we're going from here. And on the other side, those that have heard it are like, yeah, I got it. I totally understand. I'm going to take this and I'm going to go run with it. And in the end, actually, they don't. On both sides, that big assumption that's occurred because some questions weren't asked, that assumption occurs if they understand. But in actuality, when they get back together on both sides, they're like, oh no, this is not what I thought we were actually trying to do.
It's happened to all of us, right?
Yeah.
Even those of us practiced in critical thinking. And that's so interesting because when you think about critical thinking, it's it says thinking, but you can't think about things critically without additional information usually. So
Yeah.
I think that's so important to ask the questions. And I know that in my own experience with other folks, I think there can be a tendency sometimes for people to not ask questions, especially of a supervisor or somebody who's in at a higher level, because they might want to impress them where they can just run off and do this thing. They don't want to admit that they didn't understand something, and they think, well, if I'm not completely clear right now, I can figure it out because I want to perform for this person. I have talked to folks who have fallen prey to that, but getting that clarity, asking the questions
Mhm.
up front is the recipe for success.
Yeah, I agree. And I want to add, so some of the concerns of like, well, I can figure it out, or I don't want to look like I don't know. Those are all, common reasons that come up as to why people don't ask questions. Also, what can happen is on the other side is like, I've got an idea, I can solve this. They hear part of it, they think they know, and I can go, let's jump in. I've got it. I'll run with it. I've got the
Yeah.
solutions. And then I'll say on the other side, sometimes what also happens is just the time compression. Like we just have to get some stuff done. And so I think I understand enough. There's a deadline or a need to get, prioritize this thing. And so I'm gonna go in
Yeah.
essence. And so
Yeah.
those things also get in the way of like, well, let's just take a few minutes and ask a couple of key questions or just any questions, I'll say, really, to better understand it, which would then make the work that I'm going to do better. That just kind of goes out of the way because we're constantly in a whirlwind. There's lots of priorities and things are moving really fast.
Yeah, and that can be cultural too, as far as
Hmm.
we just jump in and we do, we get
Yeah.
things done. And what's critical here then is making sure that that practice of wait a minute before I rush off and start this
Mhm.
thing, it doesn't take very long. Let me ask some questions. Let me make sure that we are both 100% clear on this. And so I think that's a habit that can be
Mhm.
created.
Agreed. It's a habit that can be created. And here's where go back on the responsibilities on both sides. So if you're the leader, you're the person communicating the information, and you're sort of like, well, I told them they should understand. Maybe, but you have to go a step farther. And what you can do is you can ask questions too. It's not just on the people receiving the information. So here's a couple of examples that I like to talk about is you shared some information, you think you're clear on the objective or next steps or whatever the conversation is. Just ask, what did you hear me say? Let the person share what they heard you say. That gives you a chance to then say, oh, you have a different interpretation than what I was intending. Let me clarify that. So that's a simple question. What did you hear me say? Or what are your takeaways? Tell me what your 2 or 3 top takeaways are from this. Again, same idea. You're getting to hear from that person's perspective what they heard, and then you can clarify, clean up as necessary. Another one is, what are your next steps? What are you intending to do from here coming out of this conversation? Again, those 3 questions, pretty simple questions that'll help you better understand what that person's walking away with. Now, on the other side, eventually, again, it's a two-way street. You want your people to ask more questions. They need to get into that habit, as you said, Charlene. And so just ending the conversation with, anybody have any questions? That's not enough, because in that moment, sometimes people are like, well, no, I don't have any questions, or no, I'm not sure what to ask. All those things that we also referenced as to why they might not be asking questions. So make it a requirement. We're going to go around, and depending on the size of the group, will matter in terms of how you implement this, but you might say it is a requirement that everyone asks 2 questions. And why
Right.
2? Because it takes it beyond that initial kind of surface level question that might be there and forces people to practice, like, well, what's something else that would deepen my understanding or gain more clarity here? So have them ask 2 questions.
Yeah, I love that. I love having some specific questions to ask to get the conversation rolling because, like you said, just saying, what questions do you have is kind of like, how was school today? It's so general that it's not that people aren't trying to ask the questions. It's just that it doesn't get the brain kicked into that mode. So I love those 4 questions. I'm just going to repeat them for folks. What did you hear me say? What are your takeaways? What are your next steps? And what are at least 2 questions? And you can come up with your own questions as well to kind of prime the pump there.
Yep, agreed. And then I'll say, if you're trying to get better at also, you've got these questions, but you also just want to be better at asking questions in general. Again, that all of this is related to critical thinking, but it's maybe feels not as direct, but it is, because if you want to be able to think about something, you need to be able to ask questions. So take those questions, but also come up with some other kind of hip pocket questions. I'm not sure what to ask in this moment. Someone did say, what questions do I have? And I know that it's going to be beneficial to ask some questions. So have some go-to ones, some that you can pull out and say, I've got this 2 or 3 that I know are generally pretty good at helping me in a broad variety of situations so that I can get into that habit of asking questions.
That's great. So another area in critical thinking that I know has come up quite a bit that's maybe one of the more challenging things to address so that critical thinking is more successful is assumptions.
Mhm.
Assumptions that come into play. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, we've referenced one assumption already. It's like, I assume I understand. I assume they understand. Those are
Mm.
assumptions that happen quite frequently. So being, able to step back and say, I recognize that that's at play, and that's, again, asking some questions. The other side of this, then, on the assumptions is, we all have assumptions because that's the way we operate. So as we're going into a project, we're in a conversation, we're trying to identify a solution, stepping back and recognizing where your assumptions are really at play in your thinking, and where are they supporting and also potentially getting in your way. And actually calling them out. What we find is, in some of these conversations, if people go around and say, I'm walking in with this kind of assumption around this topic, giving it some airtime then helps them say, now, how do I make sure that assumption is not causing me to have some blinders on? Let me get some other information to either verify or actually refute that assumption. And then this is also really helpful in the decision-making process to say, we're making this decision and it's based on this assumption. It's not usually that the decision was bad or wrong. It's more like, what assumptions and logic did we use that might have been flawed or really good in terms of making this decision. So let's make sure that we identify that, so that as we're assessing throughout the process, is this assumption holding? Is it so? Yeah, and I don't want to say true, because true or false can have different connotations, but is it holding up to what we thought, was going to happen? And that then you can check back in on that.
That's great. Do you have any other examples of assumptions that you've run across, that have kind of snagged things a bit?
Yeah, so assume I understand. And so now I'm going to run on that assumption, and I'm going to go do all this work. And all along the way, I'm assuming I'm doing work that is good. What that assumption now is causing potentially an issue is I may not be checking in soon enough, because I assume the work that I'm doing is aligned with the objective. And at the end, I go back and I work with the stakeholder, the sponsor, and they might say, this is not what we intended. But because I assumed I understood, and I assumed that my work was, I'll say, in essence, on track, then that caused me to actually do some things that were not aligned with how we want to spend our time.
Yeah, and I love that, the check-in idea. It's so it's again, it's a part of communication, but without the check-in, how are you going to do a course correction? If there was some assumption or some misunderstanding in the beginning, that's how you uncover them before you've gotten too far down the road. So that's a great one, and I think it's related to another one of those critical thinking things, and I'm going to call this the big one, and that's um, clearly defining objectives
Yeah.
before jumping in. And it's part of asking questions, but it's actually a little more specific than that.
Yeah, I would agree. Oftentimes we'll have people do some self-assessments and some assessments of the team, and usually identifying the objective, or you could even think of this as, being clear on what the problem is. Either way, really what getting to the root issue is one way to think about it. A lot of people and teams think that that's one of their better competencies.
Mm,
And often what we see is, as we go through and work with them, is that's where the assumptions start to come into play of, we think we understand what's actually happening. And they're really, in the end, they need to do some more work around the objective or the solution. Really, where they tend to maybe be better is they think they understand what the objective is, and they're really good at jumping in and identifying a solution to address it, because they've
yes.
got an idea. But they haven't
Yes.
spent enough time on saying, this is really the objective, not the technical objective, but also the intended impact and the problem that needs to be solved.
Yeah, it's so like if you think of an example of this is why are we putting in automated decisioning for loans? Okay. What's the objective? The objective isn't to get the software in place or whatever it is that you're working with. What is the true objective is because you might go about it differently if you're trying to make the process faster, if that's the primary thing that
Mhm.
you're trying to do, or if you are trying to approve more of a certain level of paper. Those are two different. You will go about it differently
Yeah.
if you're depending on what the true objective is. And I think you said something earlier about different ways to get at the objective. Well, what problem are we trying to solve? That's a favorite question, and why?
And it's kind of share kind of a funny story. I was working with one group, and we're walking through doing practicing some critical thinking. And we gave them six structured, questions that they have to work through, and said, all right, here's your topic. And question one is, what's the objective? What problem are we trying to solve? That was question 1A. And question 1B then is, for this conversation, what is our objective? And I want to circle back to that, because this is where I think it can get lost on oftentimes the objective. But they're working on this 1A. And of course, there's time pressure. We only have so much time to work on this. And so the group sort of got into it, and they're like, we haven't really answered what the objective and what the real, the problem is that we're trying to solve, but we've got to get it done. We've got a deadline. And so they just moved on. And in the debrief, they had good humor about it, but they're like, this happens often where the time pressure and the deadlines, that actually becomes the driving force, not really getting the right objective and being clear on it. and then how it can just sort of cascade in terms of its impact on the effectiveness of delivering on whatever the objective was.
I wanted to circle back to you said, what's the objective for this conversation? And here's the thing where I think objective gets missed, even if people are good at identifying the objective. The question is,
Mhm.
we were having a conversation and it didn't occur to me. I don't have that habit to step back and say, wait a minute, what are we trying to accomplish here? So as many people, as they go into meetings, they say, what's the objective of this meeting? If you're not doing that, that can be super helpful. But then trying to identify, once you get into a conversation or a problem solving of any kind, wait a second, I think we need to be clear on the objective first, because that's the filter that everything else is going to go through.
Yeah, yeah, agreed. And I'll say often what happens in my experience is people want to be helpful. So take this example just to a day in and day out example. Someone comes and asks you a question. I can answer a question. No problem. I want to be helpful. Let me help you out with that. And so you give an answer, but is that really answering like the question they meant? Because sometimes people may not have, there's not all the information, they need something quick, or it's sort of like they didn't know what to ask, so they asked something. And so even
Mhm.
stepping back and just kind of being like, okay, yeah, I can help with this question, but what's the objective? Like, where does this fit in a broader context? I'll even say add this into what's your objective as a leader. If you want to be helpful and you're constantly answering questions for your team, that might be unintentionally stunting them. What might be better actually is, okay, I can answer this question, but I want to help you learn. So tell me what you think. What's your idea or your solution? And then let's go from there. So that's even building on what you said, Charlene, of like,
Yeah.
it's for a project, it might be really clear. Yeah, we need to identify an objective. And even then,
Right.
organizations struggle on it. But then you've got the meetings and then some of these day in and day out interactions of constantly stepping back and saying, if I want to think critically in this interaction, let me just first start with what conversation are we in? What's the objective of what we're
Yeah.
trying to do? And what am I trying to accomplish at the same time?
That's great. That's
Yeah.
great. And the practice aspect of it and trying to keep it top of mind until you form those habits
Mhm.
to always do that.
I want to add one more thing. This goes back to a little on the checking in piece of it is what gets forgotten the most in this is the assessment. How are we progressing? How are we doing? How did this meeting go? How did this project go? But even in the middle of it, that check in, don't assume you understand. Assess. Work with the sponsor and the stakeholder and assess, are we on track? Get 10% in and say, are we on track? Get 30% in, are we on track? So that assessment, which most often people think after the project, and even then, they don't always assess and do the postmortem of like, how did we do? It
Yeah.
doesn't, it's a constant process to recalibrate throughout. And so that's just something I want to add in here too, of like, in all of this, the assessment can also be another helpful way of asking questions, being clear on the objective, making sure that your assumptions are helpful and not detrimental or creating roadblocks. It's another piece and it gets forgotten so often.
That's great. This has been super helpful. Thanks for sharing your experiences as you've addressed critical thinking with different groups. I think you came out with some great practical tips for people
Mhm.
to use every day. So go forth and think critically, everyone. And thanks for taking some time to listen.
Thank you, everyone.